The issues of birth control and reproductive rights are familiar today to most Americans. But did you know that over a century ago, these issues were still being debated? Join us today for a discussion with a KHS research fellow who is examining the legacy of eugenics and who helps explain why these debates from over a century ago have a continuing relevance today, as we explore the pages of Kentucky history with Kentucky Chronicles. Kentucky Chronicles is inspired by the work of researchers from across the world who have conducted research at the Kentucky Historical Society, or who have contributed to the scholarly journal, the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, which has been published continuously since 1903. Hi, I'm Daniel J. Burge, the host of Kentucky Chronicles, a podcast of the Kentucky Historical Society. I'm the associate editor of the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, and I also coordinate our Research Fellows program, which brings in researchers from across the world to conduct research in the rich archival holdings of the Kentucky Historical Society. Dr. Pietra Diwan holds a Ph.D. in history from the Pontifical Catholic University of Sao Paulo. Her long-term research project focuses on confronting the legacies of eugenics. She has published widely and won several grants from Brazilian and U.S. institutions. She is an instructor of history in the History and Political Science Department at Bluegrass Community and Technical College. So is your family Italian?
Half of it.
Half Italian. My wife's Italian.
I'm Pietra from Italy. I just came from the town where my family immigrated from. It's called Macchia Godena in southern Italy.
Oh, okay.
It was like a village with 100 houses. It's still there, like all medieval. And
that's fascinating. My father-in-law just went back to Sicily for a bit, and he got to spend time and try to find his family and stuff. So it was fun. My wife's trying to get me to go, but I've never actually been to
you
Italy.
should.
So
it's a great trip. Like,
my side's more German. So.
Well, you go through German and then
she gives me a hard
go
time.
down to Italy. Yeah.
So for this podcast, we've talked to folks who have visited Kentucky from a variety of places, but you're one of the first who lives and works in Kentucky. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and what led you to Kentucky and what you do currently?
Yes, well, I was born and raised in Brazil. I did my bachelor and master's degree in history there. In 2003, we moved to Florida. My family was relocated. And in 2020, right in the middle of COVID, we were relocated again to Kentucky. So with my profession as a historian, I had to adapt to these places and even stop working for short periods of time. But when we moved back here, I was able to go back to research and to the teaching. So today I'm teaching for BCTC. I'm a history instructor there, teaching courses like survey history after Civil War, 1865, women's history in the United States, and colonial Latin America.
So we know about you because you've been here, or you were here last summer with us for a long time. But knowing what you do, could you tell us a bit about your research project, what you're working on here, what you looked at the Kentucky Historical Society, and sort of what you're doing with that project moving forward?
Well, this is the research I'm still developing is connected with my early research in Brazil somehow, because I work with the history of eugenics. So I started with the history of eugenics in Brazil. During my PhD, I did history of eugenics United States, trying to figure out how the permanences happened after 1945. And most recently, my interests go for understand how birth control in the United States and in transnational settings developed especially after 1945. So the Kentucky Historical Society provide me documentation on the Kentucky Birth Control League, and it's been fascinating work with this material.
There's so many sources here. I think the one thing that we found out was that we had a really big collection with that, and that gave you a lot to work with, which was really cool for us all. What is a larger project, though? What do you hope to do with it? Because I think that's the thing. We see fellows come in and they do all this work, but then the question is always, okay, what do you do with all of that information, and how do you sort of use all of that information?
Well, that's a good question, because when I'm looking to Birth Control League documentation in Kentucky, I'm trying to connect to this larger project that is to understand the legacies of eugenics in our society. So, of course, more particularly in the United States, different states already did this research. So we have like a very renowned research in North Carolina, in California. And I was curious about Kentucky. So did Kentucky implemented any eugenic laws, or how they deal or dealt with birth control legislation? And the Kentucky Historical Society put a light in some of these conflicts over reproduction, over the Appalachian communities, and how they not forcibly but voluntarily try to get power or more control over reproduction of their own bodies. So it's very interesting, and the documentation at the end could be connected with other experiences in the United States, but also with this larger project that we mentioned on Legacies of Eugenics, with examples in Brazil. There are like a few decades after, but it did happen also.
Now, just for listeners out there, could you tell us a little bit more about your experiences in Brazil, but also how those experiences sort of relate to what you're doing in Kentucky? Because I think for me, I took a Brazilian history class when I was in grad school. I had no idea about most of the topics. And then the thing that really interested me when I was going through that class, and maybe you could elaborate on this, is that there were so many similarities between what happens in the United States and what happens in Brazil, that there was a lot of overlap between the ending of the institution of slavery, Reconstruction, if you will. But the different sort of themes that you see in Brazilian history were very similar to what you see in U.S. history. So how does that sort of play out for listeners who might not be familiar with the Brazilian side of things? What is the history of eugenics in Brazil, or how does that sort of relate to what we see in the United States?
Yeah, it's very interesting, because as historians, we see that there's movement of trying to understand the transnational relations between countries. It's being developed more and researched more in depth. The Brazilian case, it has overlaps, but it has like a lot of differences also. If we see, for example, that Brazil is a diverse country as United States in terms of immigration and population. At the same time, some people say, oh, Brazilians, they have like a racial democracy there. So they're like far more advanced than United States, because United States invested in some sort of segregation, racial segregation. But at the end, when we see public policies to minorities over the years, we see that these populations, they were penalized by the law. So my point here is Brazil is a country with continental dimensions like United States. We have 350,000 people living in Brazil today. So because of the states, they're far apart, like Amazonas and São Paulo, that is Amazonas, that is forest, the rainforest, and São Paulo, that is like a very industrial state. They have different experience and particularities. So in the case of Kentucky, it relates, and it's very similar, the birth control movement here, it's very similar to some experiences that we had in the rainforest with the use of birth control. And the most interesting part of it is that the person or the institution that invest on that was Clarence Gamble, that was connected here in Kentucky and was investing also in Brazil.
So there's that international tie even with that. That's fascinating.
It is. And this is probably now the focus of my research, connecting these influences around both countries.
Now, this will be a follow-up to that one, but was there sort of a connection that you knew was there before you got to Kentucky? Or was it more of a, I'm in Kentucky now, let me check this out, and then you realize, oh, there's really a lot of overlap here between what I do and what I'd like to look into?
Look, Daniel, I lived like more 15 years in Florida. I never had the interest of researching birth control in Florida. And once I got here, I got this interest because I saw some subtle overlappings when I was observing and learning about the history of Kentucky. And then going deeper, this could be confirmed. But I didn't arrive here looking for this. The documentation that showed me, the records are showing me this. This is why I'm having to do the research there also. So they're kind of being simultaneously right now.
Yeah. One thing I always tell people is that being a transnational scholar is so difficult because a lot of people don't have the skills to do it, or they just don't have the experience. I know when I went to graduate school, I took a few classes in Brazilian history or Latin America and different courses, but my frame of reference was the United States. And you don't really think outside of Kentucky or outside the U.S. South. And then I think it's really important to kind of get those bigger perspectives. But one of the questions I always ask, so I will come around to this question, what was the most interesting document that you found? Was there one that stood out? Was there sort of an aha moment? Or was there anything that sort of stood out to you as you were doing research here? Because I know our listeners don't necessarily know this. You were here for a good almost over a month, 2 months, doing research. So last summer, Pietra was here for a long time doing research. So anything that sort of stood out or?
Well, I'm still here because I have things to finish. You can ask this for the girls and the people who stay on the archive, because I do like happy dances with myself all the time when I found evidence of the ideas of the thesis of the hypothesis that I designed. So the collection is small. We have 3 boxes for the Kentucky Birth Control League, but it says so much. So all the time, when I see how the commerce or the distribution of birth control products like diaphragms or the sponge and jelly, the way that they refer to this equipment, or for example, when I found letters, like first account letters of women describing the need of having birth control, or on the other hand, some doctors saying, I'm not going to push birth control for this or for this or for that, or for religious reasons, or because of the eugenic reasons, I'm not going to indicate birth control. So it's very interesting because even though it's a small collection, it has like a lot of contradictions. It poses a lot of questions. They're not so easily answered like California case, that we had a legislation and we had like a practice, a systematic practice of birth control there. So this is why I think Kentucky is fascinating.
Well, that's why we were happy to have you in, because I think it does help us to see that the collections we have do give researchers a lot to do, but it also gets it out there and it helps people to sort of see what we have. Now, one question I also usually ask our guests is about what they found most surprising about Kentucky, or what sort of they found the most interesting while they visited. But since you live in Kentucky, it might not be quite as surprising to you, or it might surprise you. But anything in the United States or since you've been here that you found to be the most interesting, either in Kentucky in particular, or just something that stands out, that a research experience or something that sort of...
I'm having like a great experience in living here, but besides the booze and the horses. No, really. I think Kentucky has, besides the nature and the abundance of water, that makes a pleasant country to live in, because being in Florida summer all year long.
Yes.
So we have some variations here. It's more diverse than I was expecting in terms of Lexington, Louisville. I had like great connections. I made already great connections and friendship here. But as a historian, I have to keep reinforcing that. Where I look, I see the inclination of the state for preservation. You know, for the people that live here, how they value preservation, historical preservation. And I have like topics of research for decades, like the narcotic farm. We have like issues with the horse, research horse industry. We have like many topics beyond birth control that can be researched here, and the weapon armory here.
Yes.
You know, you walk and you're driving and you see, oh my God, Lincoln's birth place. It's here in Kentucky. So Kentucky is a state like can be small, doesn't have like beaches, but historically it's very relevant, and I think we should explore that more. You know.
And I think that's the great thing about having you in is one of the interesting things about this state. And I know for me in particular, I do 19th century history. So a lot of times it can be such a focus on Civil War, these events, which are important. I'm not downplaying that. But to have researchers in who can show, okay, here's what's happening in the 1920s or the 30s or in the 20th century, and show that relevance today. Because like you said, there's so many interesting things that happen. To get researchers in to be able to talk about that is really cool. So with that being said, I will bring this to a close. Thank you so much to Pietra for being with us today and for researching with us.
No, thank you, Daniel. Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Although Brazil might not seem at first glance to have a lot in common with Kentucky, we hope that today's discussion has shown how individuals throughout the Americas have debated issues like birth control, immigration, and reproductive rights over the last century. Viewing history from a transnational perspective can help us understand the commonalities that stretch across borders and that unite us as humans. I would like to thank our guest, Dr. Pietra Diwan, for talking with me today. Kentucky Chronicles is presented by the Kentucky Historical Society with support from the Kentucky Historical Society Foundation. Our show is recorded and edited by Gregory Hardison. Thanks to Dr. Stephanie Lang for her support and guidance. Our theme music is used courtesy of Pixabay. To learn more about our publication, the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, or to learn more about our Research Fellows program, please visit our website, history.ky.gov. If you have enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe. It really helps us to know how we are doing. You can also help us build a following by telling your friends to subscribe.